Okay, very warm welcome to this author meets critics session. Apologies from Rory Horner. I'm not Rory Horner. I'm Khalid Nadvi. I'm shrunk from Rory Horner. Rory Horner would be up there. But Rory couldn't make it this morning because of childcare issues. So he can't be here, but he sends his apologies to everyone. But we're very pleased to have Henry Yeung. Maybe we should call him Henry Maserati Yeung. But Henry Yeung, who we all know very well and who's made a huge contribution to our field over the years. And we're here to discuss Henry's new book, Interconnected Worlds. Many of you will have seen it. Many of you will have got copies of it. And we've got a really distinguished panel of colleagues to speak to the book. Gary Gereffi from Duke, Gale Raj-Reichert from Bard College in Berlin, Eric Thun from Oxford, and Doug Fuller from City University, Hong Kong. And I think Doug is here, but he's going to be the last speaker, so hopefully he'll be here in time to comment. So of those who've seen the book, it's a very comprehensive, very detailed empirical analysis of the global electronics industry. And in a sense, what it does is it kind of builds on Henry's earlier work, his 2016 book on strategic coupling. But more substantively, the really path-breaking conceptual framing of GPN 2.0 that Henry and Neil Coe put together that created the kind of analytical framework. And this book takes that forward by providing a kind of very detailed empirical analysis of this on the global electronics industry, bringing in a great deal of new data, up-to-date data, to show how deeply interconnected these patterns and networks of production, configurations, organization, and drivers are. So the way we're going to organize the panel, and I'm going to stop speaking very quickly so that we can get the critics to speak. We're going to ask each of the critics to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. We'll then give Henry some time to respond and to speak more broadly on the book. And then we'll open it up to a wider discussion from the floor. And I hope we'll have about a half an hour to do that. So we're going to start off with Gary speaking first. This mic works. So Gary, up to you. And you have about 8 minutes.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you very much, Khalid, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. The book is an important book, but just to give the backdrop, when Henry and colleagues were working on the global production network framework in the early 2000s, around 2001, 2, was exactly the same time that a related group of us that are here were working on the global value chains approach. And I think it's been very interesting how these two literatures paralleled each other and in many ways have more similarities than differences in terms of how we can think about the global economy. And I think this book is a great reflection of the evolution of the GPN framework. Henry and colleagues, especially Peter Dicken, who was the head of a Manchester group, and Henry and Neil Coe and others were part of that, were bringing out the first wave of global production network literature. And then Henry and Neil Coe published a book that is what Henry refers to as GPN 2.0, that is trying to theorize a little bit more about global production networks. But what I want to do in my comments about this book is to emphasize why this book uses a global production network, global value chain framing to talk about the electronics industry and what we learned from that framing that we wouldn't have if you didn't use that. And then bring up a couple current relevant challenges that the book advances. First, I think it's, to me, important how timely this book is, because we've been hearing it in different sessions. The global electronics industry is probably the most sophisticated and cutting-edge manufacturing sector in the world today. It leads us into the platform economy and the digital economy, but it has roots in a lot of different topics we've been discussing. And we heard this morning a very interesting discussion of massive modular ecosystems referring to smartphones. It's part of Henry's book. So I want to make two initial points about what Henry does in the book that requires or builds on a global production network framing that we would miss if we didn't have that framing. One, Henry gives us the entire chain of activities. Later, it'll be referred to as an ecosystem, going from raw material industries like silicone, but also rare earth minerals that become very important for telecommunications. A components industry, which is extremely important. Semiconductors is only one of those, but as we've been hearing, semiconductors is probably the industry that national governments are worrying about most in terms of trying to be competitive in the global economy. But in addition to something like semiconductors and other parts, there's an entire equipment industry connected to electronics that is extremely cutting edge. People who know electronics maybe know that one Dutch company, ASML, is responsible for making the equipment used in all of the most advanced semiconductor factories around the world. And there's plenty of other specialized equipment makers that are tied into this industry. Then we have the end product companies that are ranging from the smartphones, the PC makers, consumer electronics, et cetera. So Henry has all of that. But in addition, and it ends, I think, very importantly with the role of services and digital economy in creating platform firms and the whole platform economy. So this is an industry that goes from key raw materials through a variety of components, a wide range of finished products that feed into many other industries and includes digital economy. Now, in bringing those together, I think what Henry has done in the book and what a good chain analysis or production network analysis does is it shows the critical interdependencies between those sectors. They're not just laid out there as separate industries, but you realize that if you don't have equipment makers, then you can't make leading edge components. If you don't have those components, end product industries start to fall apart. So one thing he's done is shown us how those industries are interconnected. Second, and I think particularly important from the point of view of the global value chain and global production network literature, in each of those segments of the industry, Henry's book focuses not only on the firms that populate those segments, but especially on the firm's strategies. And I've always been a believer that one of the things that the GVC approach has, and beginning even with commodity chains, has focused on is not just identifying lead firms, first-tier suppliers, and other suppliers. But in doing any of the industry studies that many of the people around this room have done and we're familiar with reading, you tend to get insights on the strategies of firms in those different segments. And what's particularly interesting is if you look at lead firms in a certain area and you look at their strategies, often the strategies are quite different. Lead firms may have contrasting strategies or be making different bets in terms of how an industry evolves, and that's extremely important to piece that together. You'd think that the economics literature, which is also focusing on impact of industries and GDP, might focus on that, but it's really the international business group, together with some of the economic geographers and sociologists and development economists who are focusing on strategies. But why strategies are important is twofold. One, the strategies lie behind critical organizational innovations that are part of these key industries. And I think something that's not well appreciated oftentimes in the GVC literature is how almost every one of the industries we've looked at over time has had really important organizational innovations that are a byproduct of globalization. So if I think about the apparel industry that I did a lot of work on early on and introducing the notion of buyer-driven chains, a very important organizational innovation in buyer-driven chains like apparel was triangle manufacturing. You'd have a set of companies that would initially be the ones producing end products. They'd become too expensive, like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. They would then become producers of intermediate goods for another set of countries that would produce the final goods and onward. So that's one kind of organizational innovation. Tim Sturgeon, back in 2002, when we were working on the GVC literature, wrote a really important article about modular production networks. Modular production networks, another organizational innovation that grew out of not only electronics and autos, but had implications for many other industries. We heard this morning about massive modular ecosystems. I think it's another organizational innovation. In Henry's book, what I think is really important about electronics that maybe we take for granted, but you really need to understand how it emerged, was that in the mid-1980s, the electronics industry developed a fabless foundry model where some companies focused on making chips for other companies that would do a lot of the design work, et cetera. And you began to get an industry structure that had integrated device manufacturers or IDM firms and fabless producers. And playing that out then brings you to a position today where you get a country or a company like TSMC in Taiwan, which becomes a leading edge firm based on a fabless foundry model that was set in place 3 decades earlier. So I think Henry's book, in lots of detail, provides us the full evolution of this global electronics production network. It tells us a lot about the strategies and the conflicts that emerge in creating this industry. But I think it leads to 2 really important episodes that people are focusing on today. I had been looking carefully at what the US was doing under the Biden administration in terms of supply chain policy. And some of you know that in June 2021, the White House came out with something called a resilient supply chain report that focuses on 4 industries, and semiconductors was one of them, and electric vehicles, and pharmaceutical active ingredients and rare earth minerals were the other 3. But I think in each of those industries, there's been this concern. I mean, semiconductors was kind of first and foremost, and there's 2 segments of the semiconductor industry we often don't distinguish, but the book does. One segment is the producers of advanced semiconductors, which is defined in the book and elsewhere by companies that could make semiconductors at under a 10 nanometer node scale, which is 7 nanometers. There's only 3 or 4 countries in the world that can do it. TSMC and Samsung are 2 leaders, Intel's another, and then companies like Huawei are really wanting to be players in that space. So there's one set of issues around who's going to control the production of advanced semiconductors. But there's a second set of issues around legacy semiconductors. So we know, like in the automotive sector, that there's a lot of shortages of cars because factories can't produce enough of the older chips, when in this case are 28 to 40 nanometer semiconductors. What's happening in the United States, and Henry's book helps us understand a bit about the background, they're looking at old factories that can be redesigned to make legacy chips using really advanced technology. So even understanding in the case of semiconductors, which is only one piece of this global electronics industry, the battles that are going on in terms of how do you make advanced versus how do you make legacy, which are the leading companies and countries involved, all of that's in the book. Final point, which is how does this take us forward? And since Henry's an economic geographer, I want to push him on one key issue, because the book is talking about the East Asian electronics ecosystem. And it raises this question, well, why did East Asia emerge of all the other regions of the world as having such a resilient industry that evolved over 3 or 4 decades that Henry tracks for us? This morning, we heard Eric Thun and Tim talk about definition of ecosystems and how we might think about the complexity of that. Henry's book alludes to it, but the question I guess I want to push Henry on is, everybody is now thinking of the global economy and participation in it, I think, with this ecosystems or regional value chain, regional production network notion. And in doing so, they're thinking about strategic partnerships that cut across these geographic ecosystems. So given all the tensions that we know exist in this multipolar world, but you're putting the East Asian electronics ecosystem as having been a model of resilience in the industry up to now. What do you see as the fault lines that are going to emerge as Europe and North America or other regions of the world want to get a bigger piece of what's going on in terms of the global electronics industry? And I think you've created a really compelling story about the evolution of that region in the global electronics industry, but where do you see things going in the next 5 years, and how might we get some changes in the ecosystem model that you laid out? But it's a great book, and it's one of the only full-length studies that brings all these pieces together, so I'm really happy it's out, and it's not surprising to me that Henry wrote it. Congratulations.
So thank you, Henry, for letting me be on this panel. And thank you to Rory, or whoever is representing Rory, Khaled, for actually forcing me to read a book in a long time. I have been working on the electronics industry, global production networks, for a bit, but I have to admit, in the last 2 years, I've kept my eye off as I've had children at home with lockdowns and needing to cook meals, clean more dishes than I've ever had in my life. So this was a catch-up for me, and it was fantastic. I'm going to make comments based on the empirics, the theoretical contribution, and also a couple of words on the relevance for future research. So to start with the empirics, this is what the book should be applauded about, I really think. It's full of details, and in some ways, I think it is a reference now from people who want to study, understand, research the electronics industry, and so this has to be applauded. In the last 5 years, there's been fast and significant changes and transformations, and that really comes out with all the details and the numerous amounts of, I think, painstaking evidence and data that you've put into making your arguments, and that's in itself a major contribution. So as Gary said, it talks about different segments of the industry. Semiconductors is a big part of it, also for me, in terms of learning new things. But it also covers the trajectories of the PC industry, mobile phones, and also televisions a bit here and there. I think for me personally, because I've only looked at sort of the computers and consumer electronics industry, the story of semiconductors is striking. I think that's just it. It's striking. And so, you know, when I used to see TSMC in the news, I now have a much better understanding of why that was such a newsworthy item. And Henry really walked us through that historical development very nicely. In terms of the theoretical contribution, it's, as a GPN GVC researcher, we're interchangeable. It's greatly appreciated, and as Henry wrote, I think towards the end, it's a stress test of the GPN 2.0 theory. And so there are these different, I won't go into the details of it. Also read the GPN 2.0 book to complement this one. But there are these causal dynamics, risk factors that are discussed, and just how different they are for those different product segments, which makes this industry just complex. And so there's lots of detailed discussions around that. I won't have so much time, but just to maybe pick up on just a couple of things that were striking to me is just how, for example, the discussions around sustaining market development, as you've called it, is so different for semiconductors as opposed to consumer electronics, which is more volatile. But semiconductors are so important as an input that the story in that in itself is distinguishing. The discussions around financialization, bringing that back into GPN research is important. And also, I think the point about how Western-based firms that are more pressured by shareholder pressures or venture capital just have a different outlook compared to East Asian firms that have patient capital or state support. I think that was a really important point to bring out as well. Managing risks, there were several that were discussed. I think you've listed them quite nicely, and one could slot whatever risk into economic, product, regulatory, geopolitical, very important one, labor and environment. I'll come back to that in a second, and I think what's really different in terms of also thinking about how we've been thinking about globalized industries and paying a lot of attention to outsourcing and inter-firm relationships is the additional strategy of intra-firm strategies, which Henry goes into quite a bit of detail to show how important that is as well. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I could just read a paragraph here that I've written, but that's just kind of notes for me. But the example of Samsung and semiconductors is one great example of how inter-firm keeping things in-house is actually more strategic for a firm who wants to protect their technological advancements, and outsourcing isn't always a lower cost strategy. And I'll spend a bit more time talking about extra firm bargaining, extra firm actors. Oops, I'm gonna lose my notes. And I think throughout the book, I think it's fair to say, Henry, that you do bring the state back in a strong way. Even though we have a section, you have a section on extra firm bargaining, but you do get the regulatory discussions and the geopolitics throughout the book, which makes it actually quite political economy in itself. So I enjoyed reading it from that angle as well. And of course, I'm just gonna scroll down, the big story is, China, the US trade war with China, which is a common theme in many parts of the book. But I think in a way, this very decisive take on thinking about these geopolitical tensions, if I may be so bold to say that I think this book really sets out now for GPN research or GVC research that to do it seriously does require thinking about the state, the role of regulations and the different forms of political pressures that shape and push industries. I think we can't ignore that anymore, especially in this post world, post-war, post-COVID, climate change world on fire, whatever. So I could say much more about that, but I'm going to run out of time. So I'll just talk a little bit about the future research questions. You've also outlined them quite well in different categories, thinking through, obviously, politics, resilience, and also technology. As I said, the state is back. Industrial policy is important. I thought that was really interesting for you to also discuss some of the misconception. I don't know if it's a misconception, but there was a really interesting point made about the ineffectiveness of local content regulations. And this is sort of the backbone of industrial policy for a while. And that was a really interesting take. And to think about that when those of us who kind of bring in a development studies angle to this and are advising governments, what do we advise them about when we want to think about supplier capability building, et cetera. I also found that fundamentally the discussion or the firm strategies are about trade and investment policies. So what companies, lead firms can trade and invest, and you had this really nice sort of matrix of inside out, outside in. Please read the book. I won't go into the details. I need to reread it again. Is dependent on these policies. What's allowed and isn't allowed, what is regulated and isn't regulated is equally important. And I think I could keep going, but the role of technology towards the end, you did bring in a really important point about, I would think it's called, you did talk about technology advancements shaping the causal dynamics that firms are going to be confronted with. And here, quote unquote, Industry 4.0, technological developments are going to be an important thing to consider. So I'm right there with you on that, thinking about automation, machine learning, AI, and how that's going to come in how lead firms and these strategic suppliers shape their shape the industry moving forward. Yeah, I think I'm going to run out of time, am I?
2 more minutes.
I have 2 more minutes. Good, I have 2 more bullet points.
We're eating into Doug's time.
Oh, okay, we've got extra time because of Doug. So then I will maybe then just end with one point, and which is on the politics and the geopolitical context. For me, I've also been researching on labor governance, and of course this book isn't about labor governance, but the approach of trying to understand anything to do with labor governance has to start with industry and what industry, how it functions, what's driving it. And so what I took away from this, thinking about what's happened on the labor front in terms of forced labor, et cetera, is how it fits so nicely with this geopolitical discussion about the US trade war with China and how labor groups have been able to jump on this geopolitical opportunity to make the issue on forced labor in the Uyghur community, for example, in China, become part of this geopolitical dynamic in the US. So that was really interesting, and that's what I found to be, quite complementary or useful for me personally in my own research. And of course, I'll just say again, having not paid attention to this stuff for a couple of years, this was like a bombshell. So everyone go out and read the book. It's a great resource, and Henry has done a really amazing job on it.
I think all the key things have been said. I can keep my comments brief here. I also reiterate what a benchmark study this is. That in the introduction, Henry, there's a moment of doubt where I think he realized that his data stops in 2019, and a lot's happened since 2019. And I think he was thinking about that as he was writing the introduction and said, well, I think this is still going to be a foundation. And that's absolutely right, that I think for a long time to come, this will be the foundational work for what is pivotal industry in the world. And that's because of both the depth of the work and the data that he has, but also the breadth in terms of looking at a whole range, looking at the global electronics sector in its entirety. And I say this as someone, some of you were with us this morning where I was talking about the project that Tim Sturgeon and I have been working on, where we're doing sort of a piece of this now in terms of the mobile handsets. And so seeing this, the breadth of the work is really awe-inspiring. And it's combined with a very innovative conceptual framework for pulling it together. And so I think that this is going to be with us for a long time to come. Just, I think, 2 quick comments. The first is of the title, Interconnected Worlds. Henry, really, you make the point of these interconnections in great detail. And so, for instance, you talk about how U.S. success in design for semiconductors rest upon the capabilities of other firms and countries with respect to foundries. That you couldn't have these design capabilities without the foundries. At the same time, you couldn't have these foundries without the equipment suppliers for the foundries. And so these are the interconnections that are in the title. At the same time, and this isn't in the title, but it's in the text, you often talk about the sort of the transformational shift that has taken place during this period that you're talking about, and the leading role of East Asia in this industry, and how the center of gravity is a term that you use quite frequently, has shifted to East Asia, and these seem to be somewhat contradictory. There's a little bit of tension here. Is it about interconnections? Or is it about the center of gravity moving to East Asia? And I guess I would push you a little bit on that, because I'm not sure that the center of gravity has shifted to East Asia. That East Asia has been, it plays a dominant role, but it's partly about the data that you're using, which is focused on hardware. And I also got this question this morning about what are the biases of using hardware rather than focusing on software. But it's focusing, the manufacturing, without a doubt, takes place in East Asia. And so if you're looking at these activities, it is definitely an East Asian-centered industry. But we've also seen the vulnerabilities in stark relief over the past couple of, really since 2016, that, to give an example, the Chinese mobile handset producers, which essentially had to stop production overnight when they were cut off from components. So can it really be a leading role when, as soon as you're cut off from this ecosystem or whatever you want to call it, you have to cease production? And so it really seems to me as if there's, everybody, there's no leading role here, and that it's really, each part is going to be equally dependent on the other. And this is something, that I've had to think about as well, that once you bring in the role of software, if you're talking about global electronics these days, what is the global electronics industry that we all sort of, live in without thinking about the role of software and app development and all the things which rest upon the hardware? And in some respects, hardware is now sort of the pipes, through the plumbing, which everything flows, and everything is happening on top of that. And so this isn't really, it doesn't really change. I mean, basically, it's reinforcing your title and saying that, I agree completely with the title, but I'm more skeptical about sort of the sub theme which runs through the text in terms of the leading role of East Asia. So I guess my question would be, well, do you think that there is a tension there, and which is it? The second key thing.
Don't worry. No, it's just in time. Perfect time.
The second aspect which I would point to is the causal drivers. And with the causal drivers, for those of you that haven't, I guess most of you haven't read the book yet since it just came out last week, he has a really fantastic diagram where he identifies the dependent variable as being firm strategy. And so firm strategy is very much really about sort of the boundaries of the firm in terms of its interfirm coordination, interfirm partnerships, extra-firm bargaining, interfirm coordination. And then the independent variables, or the causal drivers, are the cost capability ratio, market making or thinking about markets, financial discipline, and the risk environment. And this I thought it's ambitious in terms, firm strategy can be a result of many different aspects. And I wasn't sure that this captured all of them, in particular if you think about changes over time. And so, for instance, Apple has had big shifts in strategy over time in terms of outsourcing certain activities, then bringing them back in-house in terms of design of semiconductors. And I wasn't quite sure how they would relate to these causal drivers. And in many respects, I saw this as, it's taking in whole fields and literatures in terms of thinking about these firm strategies. I was also thinking about the role of technology in terms of technological shifts and how they've changed over time, how they've impacted the industry. My guess is that would be taken up in terms of capabilities. But in some respects, it seemed as if some aspects of firm strategy were dropping out. Also, in terms of politics, I guess I thought that being a political scientist, that some of it could be more explicit in terms of the role of the state and the institutions, that a lot of work was done by financial discipline. And financial discipline, I almost thought, this is sort of thinking about institutional differences, but a lot of that is relating to differences in political structures. And some of that I thought could be even more explicit. But overall, I just thought it's just a fantastic piece of really awe-inspiring research, which I think are going to be we're going to be really turning to for many years to come. And now that Doug's back in the picture, I better wrap up because we were compensating on him.
Absolutely. I'm going to break back those extra 2 minutes you were going to get.
Oh, I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. So Doug, you have 8 minutes.
Okay.
Don't repeat what we said before.
I was going to cheat and sort of piggyback on the comments of the others. If Eric checks his mobile phone, he will find on several different platforms I tried to contact him, but it all failed. WhatsApp, WeChat. If I knew if you were on Signal, I would have tried that. iMessage. Anyway, yesterday when I came to this campus, I followed other people, and today I just inputted in my Google phone. I was wondering, this seems like it's taking an awful long way. And then I went to the lovely Science Park campus, which I'm happy to report is very nice, but it's 45 minutes from here. So, but anyhow, to return to the matter at hand of Henry's book, also as a political scientist, I want to sort of build on some of the points Eric made and push them a little further. This is a little bit unfair to Henry since he already wrote a book about sort of the state and GPNs and strategic coupling. But I do wonder here if somehow some of the explanations are really putting the state too far in the background. And I'm going to reference this vis-a-vis the semiconductor industry, which I know best. Simply put, I mean, if you look at the last 20 years, the three economies that really have grown their share of global semiconductor capacity are Taiwan, Korea, and China. They've also heavily subsidized that industry. Who has lost market share? Europe, United States, Japan. Japan used to subsidize its industry, then through this long, painful period of deleveraging, no longer did that. So they have the largest number of fabs in the world, but they tend to be very old fabs with smaller capacity. So I think that's, I think really needs to be somewhat forefronted here. I mean, and particularly when you're thinking of financial discipline, is that really what is going on in this industry? I would question that. I think bringing back the role of the state plus how various firms approach patient capital and how various states approach patient capital explains a lot about industry specialization, subspecialization over time, and why at the end of the day, in the very short term, because this book is sort of really looking at explaining the near term, why TSMC and Samsung ended up with the firms with the most advanced process capabilities. So, in the Korean case, there's been this long-term trend, which is, I agree with Henry that the state's role has not been as ambitious or active as in the past, but I think in this industry, they're still very willing to support the industry. In the Korean case, they were very willing to do that to build very large corporations, which is why on the memory side, it's not surprising that 2 of the 3 of the big players there are Korean. I think actually the more interesting case there is Micron. Why is Micron able to survive? Doesn't make any sense. It's from a country notorious for its lack of patient capital, for the boom and bust cycles of memory manufacturing that seems very unsuitable, and yet it survives. I would add, you maybe gave Micron in America too much credit, because I think you referenced in at least one of your chapters that, it still has a lot of American-based manufacturing. which is true, but over time, through acquisition, it's acquired a lot of manufacturing capability in East Asia and Taiwan and Japan. But yet it's a very curious case that I think might be useful to revisit the general trends you try to lay out vis-a-vis the firm level strategies. And then if you look at, so the story in part is, why does Intel lose out to Samsung and TSMC, I guess, in this sort of 2015 to 18 and beyond time frame, since you do hopefully update it a bit. And I kind of feel that on the one hand, it doesn't take enough account these national institutional structures that these various firms are reacting to. Intel, at various points in time, in recent times, being led by accountants and sort of reacting as such, now sort of stepping back from that model, but at the same time, I think hoping to get subsidies from various governments, the US government, in Europe as well, to support a reinvigorated manufacturing strategy. Whereas I think if you're TSMC or Samsung, you are not having the same level of pressure to justify quarterly results, which has led to a very different approach. I also just, I'm getting into the nitty-gritty here, but I do wonder if it's just you make a big point of Apple's switch from Samsung to TSMC as sort of almost a determining factor in TSMC's dominance. But I think there's a longer-term story you could tell, and in the foundry market, TSMC invented this model, led at the beginning, led 10 years after the beginning, leads now. It's always been the leader in the foundry market. And you couple that with the general trend of more and more outsourcing of production and fewer IDMs, that it's not as surprising. And if you're saying, well, but now they're leading at the most advanced nodes, the story could also be that the CPU isn't really necessarily this leading edge chip that it was in the past. So, it's a bit like in the early 1980s, everyone was convinced they still had to manufacture DRAM because that was leading process technology then. You could tell the story that there's these other chips out there that are very advanced that have nothing to do with Intel's main specialty chips. Intel itself had tried to get into like application processors and failed. That sort of explain a big part of that transition as well. I'm probably...
You're at, well, you've got a minute.
Okay, no, I think I'll stop there. But overall, I'd like to second what Eric said, that I do think it's a stimulating, ambitious book that provided a lot of food for thought. So thank you.
Great. We're going to give, do you want to come stand up? Yeah. We're going to give Henry some time to speak to the book and to speak to some of the comments that were raised. I just want to kind of highlight a few that I've jotted down. Gary, for example, talking about questions around what are the emerging fault lines? Where will things go in the next 5 years? Gale raised questions around thinking about labor governance and politics. Eric, raised a number of questions. One was, is there really a shifting center of gravity to East Asia? What about the vulnerabilities in this system? And also thinking about the analytical framework a bit more carefully. And Eric and Gale and Doug, I think, have all sort of raised questions around politics and the role of the state and how that determines the dynamics in this sector. I had some questions as well, but I'm going to hold those back till the Q&A.
Okay.
So over to you, Henry.
Less than 10 minutes.
You have 10 minutes.
Okay.
You've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Khalid, for chairing this, and thank you to Rory for co-organizing the session, and of course Doug from Network B, is it? Hi. And Mark Dallas for supporting this initiative. It's my great honor and privilege to be here to meet our critics. Actually, very great people, and you know, Gary's work, which has foundational impact on the work that I do. And many of you making a I mean, I thought I'm only meeting the 4 of them here, but surprisingly, there are 20, 30 of you. So thank you for being here. And as you can tell, it's great that, you know, after 2 years of Zoom and seeing my garden, I'm physically here now, no more in the Zoom garden background. So just say a few words about the origin of the book, in the sense that a few years ago, when I was at the Washington, D.C. American Association of Geographers annual meeting at a pub, I met up with my economic geography friends, including Rory. I was discussing, saying that, hey, you know, I've done up this work empirically in the electronics industry, but thinking about what to do with it, yeah? Write some articles or write a book. And none of them was very enthusiastic about a book. So I thought, oh my God, okay, then maybe just do journal articles. So I mean, this book, as I wrote in the acknowledgement, I acknowledged them for having very different responses to the initial interest in doing a book, which I end up eventually writing because COVID strike, right? So nothing to do at home every day. Might as well do a book. So that's how the book came about, in a sense. I must thank Martin Kenny, who unfortunately couldn't make it here. Martin Kenny and Florida and Kenny. If you do platform capitalism, you know Martin Kenny's work very well. Martin Kenny is a book series for which I submitted this book proposal at the beginning, and of course the Stanford editor, Steve Catalano, Italian actually by origin, so for being very interested in this work and pushing me hard to really make the book relevant to, if you like, the 2020s. So many of the stories, in fact, the critics brought up were really put in after extensive comments and interests from my 2 editors. Martin, for example, himself, very interested in the digital economy, pushed me to think through the continuous and dominant role of the US today in the global electronics industry, particularly in the software side. Yes, we know number 1. Equipment, yes, we know number 1. Actually, in chip design software, US dominates. If you don't have the software, you can't design the chip well. Huh? So that's fantastic. And the other aspect was the geopolitical, if you like, the role of the state, that again, Martin and my editor and the reviewers were very interested and concerned. So this originally was meant to be kind of just industrial organization study. But as I was writing, gosh, the world was changing in a serious way. I mean, so in a way, I never thought the book would be this relevant, right? I mean, if there was no pandemic, you were not stuck at home buying more PCs, smartphones, and then of course the semiconductor become part of the geopolitical imperatives. The book would be just another electronics book, right? So essentially what I did in the book was to really break it down, the electronics industry, as we heard the term, into 4 major segments. Yeah? Today, mobile handset is the number 1, actually, in terms of value. About half of the global electronics industry belongs to mobile handset because it's 1 billion units sold every year. So you can imagine the total value of this industry, this segment. Then followed by PCs, notebooks, because it's all-time high now. Many of you buy new notebooks. Yeah? Then semiconductors in terms of total revenue. But of course, semicon being technologically the most advanced among the 3. Followed by last, TV or consumer electronics. But very few of you keep changing your washing machines and so on, right? So consumer electronics, in good old days, if you read the last comprehensive book written on the electronics was Alfred Chandler, 2001, actually, in a free press book, comparing the electronics industry. And if you look at then, consumer electronics was still very important in the 1990s. Today, much less. due to in fact, due to the reason Eric's presentation this morning exactly show you, the phone will have done everything for you, so to speak. It's TV, it's computer. This phone is more powerful than the original Enigma machine. If you watch the Alan Turing machine, bigger than this wall. This phone is mathematical, computing power-wise, bigger than that one. Can you imagine that? So that's really how I was interested in this, written about the book. The term, so in my comments, I will also, along the way, respond to some of the comments and points raised, but maybe I will name, then make it easier. So for example, Eric mentioned the interconnected worlds issue. So when I wrote the book, I actually had a long discussion with Neil Cole, was still in the department, the title. So I was interested in using a term that talks somehow about worlds because of our economic geographer Michael Stopper's work, worlds of production. So you know the industrial district debate, right? Many Italian friends here, yeah? So industrial district is very, very prominent in economic geography, yeah? About specialization and so on and so forth. So in Michael Stopper's work, worlds of production, they theorize how, if you like, different parts of the world have different ways of production. So the idea of worlds emerged from there. But then I was thinking, hey, but then, and hence again, responding to Eric's point, center of gravity, is that in my first chapter, I actually introduced different worlds. So if you think of the global electronics industry, it used to be dominated, well, in good old days, by Europe, not even America, okay? So if you think of the good old days of the German TV maker, for example, a Telefonica or something like that, then the French company, right? Of course, today we still have Siemens, we still have Philips, and so on and so forth. And from that world of national production, national means almost everything produced domestically, there was fierce competition. So in my chapter 2, I gave long history from the origin of each of the segments. The history of the industry evolved over time from national production systems to what I call interconnected worlds of production. So it's in that sense that I use the title. The book, I being located more in East Asia, has, yes, a little bit more dramatized shift in that gravity. But to me, the shift of gravity wasn't entirely to East Asia, was more from North America, or the US in particular, and Europe, to somewhere now in probably Amsterdam. So that's the center of gravity in a mathematical sense. But you know what I mean? From very non-Asia, except Japan, to a bit more to the middle of the world, if you think in world map terms. So that's what I meant by, if you like, interconnected worlds and shift of gravity. Now, just to say a few words about methodology, of course, I was very fortunate to have a huge grant from the university to set up the Global Production Network Virtual Center. But because of that, I had enormous resources to acquire a huge database through it's a custom data set. So from IHS, Market, and so on, that really lay many of the, if you like, the what question and where. So I was interested in the what, where, how, and why of the 4 segments of the global electronics industry. Of course, in relation to the GPN 2.0 theory that Neil and I wrote in great detail, fully developed in the 2015 Oxford University Press book. Now, having that data set wouldn't be enough to explain the how and why question. It's just not possible. As some of you know my work, I'm very interested in firm-level interviews. From my PhD days to today, I've done like 400 or 500 interviews in my life. I love interviewing business people because, really I want to grill them, what they do, yeah? For this research, I was very, very fortunate to be able to have access to very, very high-level senior executives among each of the segments, probably something like between 5 to 7 of the top 10 firms, lead firms, and major suppliers or outsourced manufacturers. The only firm I couldn't interview would be Intel, Apple, and Foxconn. Okay, Foxconn. These 3 are particularly difficult, as you probably know, all right? Apart from this, I got almost everybody, all right? And among the everybody's, many were at least vice president, senior vice president, chief supply chain officers, chief technology officers. Micron, for example, is the chief supply chain officer who came from Idaho to Singapore because my sister-in-law works in Micron, Singapore. So I knew the guy was coming. I wrote to him and said, hey, if you ever come to Singapore, I would love to speak to you. And then he actually emailed me back and replied and said, okay, I'm coming next week. I knew he was coming. So I drove my Maserati to the factory gate and parked outside. I was still having my car. So to interview him, and he told me, and some of the story was captured in the quotations in the book, of which we learn from Micron that semiconductor is, and here answering Doug's question, is actually a electric, chemical, very, very, if you like, toxic way of producing chips, advanced chips, okay? If you're talking about advanced chips, it's very difficult. It's a tacit knowledge. You have to really calibrate among 600 to 800 steps of the wafer going through many processes. How do you manage that? So the reason why TSMC is so strong today vis-a-vis Intel. Now, Intel, as you know, was the inventor of integrated circuit, the first microprocessor, the first memory chip, by the way, Intel invented, okay? Intel stands for Intelligent Electronics when it was founded, okay? But the point is Intel makes primarily microprocessors, CPUs, as Doug just outlined to you. So many of us love foods, right? Okay, so we're Italian and French here, okay? So let's say you're the Italian food specialist, you're the French specialist. What TSMC Taiwan does is a central kitchen. It makes for all of the Michelin star restaurants of different flavor, Italian, French. So you can imagine why TSMC today is so good, because it really has mastered not just Italian food, but also French, but Chinese and Japanese. The secret sauce, the very tacit way of making it in the finest possible way, yeah, at 5 nanometers, 7 nanometer. Now, Intel, unfortunately, is only Italian, only produce Italian food, which is microprocessor. Why TSMC today has a unique ecosystem among, all of its suppliers, design companies in the US, wafer suppliers, chemical, gas, all sorts of stuff. But TSMC has mastered that tacit knowledge of, if you like, electric, chemical processes. So it's in that sense that TSMC, not too long ago, about 2015 onwards, overtook Intel in process technologies, in manufacturing chips, as you know of today. But hey, this can change. Who knows? Intel can catch up, okay? Because Intel's dominated manufacturing technology of chips for 3-4 decades. Yeah. So it's quite recent. Things can go wrong the other way around. Who knows? So this is a very unique industry. But I had the privilege of learning a great deal from many of these senior people through many of the very interesting discussion. The Samsung example, for which we talked about how Samsung makes the initial chips of iPhone 2007 to 2015-16. It happens that the person who looked after my Samsung visit, the Senior Vice President of Global Relations, he himself, Carnegie Mellon PhD, South Korean guy, he himself was then the guy who got the Apple business in 2007. He is himself semiconductor guy, engineer. So he told me that story, which I reproduce in the book, but I have to write in a way that doesn't infringe on my institutional review board, ethics. So, but it was a very, very special story. It's not in the public, no matter how. Previously, I was very interested. Why would Samsung make the initial application processor for iPhone chips 2007 to 2016? Second, why then TSMC took over the business? I've written it in great detail, 4 or 5 pages, I think, in the book for that story. So that by now you have a sense, oh, that's how TSMC got the business. It's high risk because you have to have dedicated fabs for Apple, which Samsung didn't want it. Okay, Samsung could have invested, but didn't want it. So TSMC got the job, but then did it so well that Apple and TSMC are mutually locked in now. 25% of TSMC business comes from Apple. And that's why Apple now can decide to dump Intel and come up with its own M1 and M2 chips. I'm a die-hard Mac supporter, Macintosh. So because of that, the M1, M2 chips had a lot to do with the fact that Apple and TSMC are basically mutually, so to speak, locked in that sense of the word. So final, just maybe a few words about geopolitics, role of the state to Gale and Gary's comments. These are big issues. I'm not really a big sort of scholar of geopolitics. I mean, you know, in human geography, there is political geography and geopolitics. So I have a lot of geopolitics colleagues who can analyze the geopolitical broad world. For this study, I was primarily interested in understanding how this industry is organized, has evolved, has, if you like, transformed from a nationally bounded production systems to interconnected worlds of production, so to speak. The political factor is always important, but the way I wrote the book was very much to focus still on the industry rather than to talk about too much of the politics. Mainly for the reason that I feel the political is always very difficult to command. First, it's very difficult to do empirically. Why? Because politicians, whatever, or even policymakers, whatever they tell you, it's very hard to, if you like, develop the full proper story, you know. And then policy documents are, as you know, very cleaned. Yeah, so it's very hard to really get the juicy part out. So I just find political research fundamental. I mean, I respect our dear political scientists' work extremely well. I mean, Doug's work on China, as you can tell, is very politically sensitive. I mean, you should read his Dragon book with OUP, I think, right? Yeah, 2016, 17. Yeah, and very, very great, well-developed book. It's just difficult to do. So for this product research, I did not really go great into the political for that reason. And hence, the political part you read in the book has a lot to do with, again, Martin and my SUP editor pushed me to, hey, you know, now the world is changing, you know, as we are doing this, please do something for marketability, you know, the market imperative, the book has to sell. Okay, all right, I mean, relevance to the American audience, yeah? So in that sense, then I said, okay, I should reflect from the beginning to the end what all this mean for the future. Okay, so to answer Gary's question in the next 5 years, to me, it's going to be a very difficult period because, I mean, China wants to bypass US technology restrictions, but it's very difficult to do in the semiconductor. It's primarily in the semiconductor industry, even though I think, was it Eric who mentioned that, say in the mobile phone case, Huawei, the moment US chop off the technology, you don't get a chip. Huawei couldn't really compete in the smartphone industry. Yes, but then the smartphone business of Huawei was sold to the Shenzhen government-organized consortium, and with now another brand called Honor. So actually, Huawei smartphone is reinvented as another smartphone company called Honor. All right. So, but by the way, there are other Chinese smartphone companies which gained market share because Huawei went down. Right. Xiaomi, Vivo. And so on. So actually, if you look at the smartphone industry, you're only left with Apple, you know, from the US. That's it. Number 2 is Samsung, and then the rest are all Chinese. So in that sense, I don't think the US, you can, say all of the China brands cannot sell US technology to them. I don't think that's feasible. The moment US did that, it will be technology war. China will restrict. China will just say all Apple phones cannot be sold in China. All Apple products out of China. Then basically the end of story, right? Isn't it? So it's Armageddon, right? I mean, if we do it this way. So the US can only restrict Huawei is because of its actual 5G and the telecom side that is threatening national security, not really the smartphone itself, but smartphone is a collateral damage, I would say. So it's in that sense that I'm less worried about US technology imposition on China. I think currently it's targeted at specific either company and or military-related operations. But if the relationship turn into much worse of a kind of really mutual boycott, but that you know is going to be bad for all of us. There are no winners if the US and China really went into full-blown sort of technology/economic war. I hope not. Because Singapore will suffer. Just a minor story responding to Doug's final question, which is why Micron? Actually, you'll be amazed. I mean, Singapore now produce more wafers than the entire Europe. All of the fabs add up. Can you believe that? Singapore, a little red dot on Earth. All our fabs are foreign-owned. Micron's business in Singapore is gigantic, enormous. All the latest generation fabs are built in Singapore, making memory chips. So, I mean, because my sister-in-law works in it, I have unique stories about that. Okay, so that will be it from me. It's a fantastic study. It's, to me, once a lifetime experience doing a book of this nature. Very much I learned about industry-level study. It's beautiful. I mean, if you can afford the time, ideally some resources, a few $100,000, do an industry study. It's great fun. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.
So we have a bit of time for a Q&A, if you're okay with that, Henry, yeah? So we're going to open it up to the floor, see if we can take maybe 2 or 3 rounds, depending on how many questions we get. So if you can raise your hands if anybody wants a question, go 1, Tim, go ahead.
I think yes.
Yeah, so I guess following up on Eric and Doug in a sense, I mean, just put it like in a cartoon way, you know, East Asia is obviously just a powerhouse with electronics. It's been for a really long time. I think Japan and South Korea, you know, they both came in, you know, before GVC, really, you know, before, I mean, yeah. So there's a question of Taiwan and Singapore is an interesting case, but, you know, like I said, red dot, you know. So, you know, everything, it seems like there's still China is sitting at the bottom of the smile curve. So mostly manufacturing, right? So I just don't see that adds up to the center of gravity. One thing I do see is that what China has done is like worked so hard to kind of capture these kind of growing dominant industry, but things move so quickly. By the time they do, like, it doesn't matter anymore. So you get PCs, you get TVs, you know. So so I'm just putting things very starkly. So I don't quite. I think that's a really kind of a point that I haven't read the book. So the center of gravity towards Asia, I get. Center of gravity towards China, I just have big doubts about. That doesn't mean that, you know, these things take so long to develop. So there's, you know, there's obviously things are going to change over time. But it just, if you look at the software side, and, you know, like you said, chip design, equipment, you know, all the way down the line, it's so dominated by kind of OECD countries, I would say, that it's hard to understand how that would change. And then the Armageddon, you know, scenario that you put out is really is terrifying.
Yeah.
I think it really would be negative. And I think in that sense, China holds a huge pile of cards because that bottom of the smile curve pile is bigger than electronics. It's like every single thing that you go into big box stores in the U.S. is coming from, right?
Yeah.
So if you talk about inflation, I mean, if you were able, if those cards are, you know, if that was cut off, the U.S. would, you know, it would be like, you know, Argentina-style inflation, or even, you know, Turkey or something like that. So there'd be a huge backlash. So I think that those scenarios are absolutely frightening, but that's how I see, in a very simplistic and, you know, without all the caveats and exceptions that go underneath that, along in a longer discussion, how things are sitting right now, and this kind of, on this kind of knife edge. And Apple was not able to stop the Trump administration from essentially putting tariffs on iPhones coming into the U.S., which I thought would never happen. So things are happening that I thought would never happen.
No.
And so we're sitting at this moment. But I understand what it's like to write a book at the moment when things are changing. I mean, we finished our last book in January 2019. So, oh no. Really relevant, you know. So I have a lot of sympathy on that front, but it just, anyway, I don't expect you to go back and write it again. So how do you handle that? You know, that kind of disjuncture between the main argument. It seems like a main argument of the book, and maybe I'm reading it wrong. That it's not China, but it's East Asia. So.
Okay, should we just take a couple more? Yep, Valentina.
So thanks. You all made a great work about having us very interested into reading this book now. So just to challenge also, like I've never been working on electronics, and I found all these fascinating stories you're telling about, especially the idea of the center of gravity that is changing. Very intriguing. I was wondering though, just again to push you to be even more like marketable without convincing everyone to get it. What do you think, to what industry or you think, what other contexts you think these evidence that you have been suggesting could be applied for? It seems there is, I mean, it is a very industry-focused study, but I'm wondering to what extent this could also tell about a very diverse industry or not. So I would be curious to see to what extent you see going forward these insights that you learned in this industry could also inform different type of industries that, for example, other manufacturing industries that have a different story, but for which, for example, Asia has also be central. Shall we expect similar dynamics, or because of industry specificity, this won't happen? So just to challenge you also to discuss that.
Great. So I'm going to throw in a question as well, and we can then take another run. So, when I was looking through the book, and I have to admit, I haven't read it, I have flicked through it. I have to go and buy the copy. So I've only looked at it online. But I was reminded by, when I was thinking about this book, about Mike Hopday's book. And you and I were sort of briefly talking about it the other day. So Mike Hopday wrote a book 25 years ago that came out of his PhD work. Well, actually not out of his PhD work. His PhD was on Brazil, but called Innovation in East Asia. And that book was on the semiconductor industry and really focused on Taiwan and the growth of the Taiwanese case study. And I was wondering, what struck me in hearing you talk and thinking about this sector, and it's a sector I don't really know that well, is that innovation has remained, or rather, it remains relatively concentrated in that region. Which raises questions around this point that both Tim and Eric have raised. Is this a shifting center of gravity, or is this just that there is a critical mass that you cannot do without in this GPN, in this value chain network? That is where it's concentrated, and that's where these emergent firms are. And what does that then imply for where innovation lies in these sectors? And I'm wondering whether the innovation is really the hand phone, or the innovation now questions around both the software but also the infrastructure of telephony, which is where, Huawei and ZTE then put a lot of their emphasis on and so on. So then the debates around 5G become more critical. So that's one question. And the other question I want to throw in is, in what ways will environmental considerations going forward, picking up on Gary's point, where trajectory is going to lie? So if we're going to think about sort of, environmental challenges, there's been a lot of debate in the sector, I know from Gale's work earlier on, around, thinking about environmental governance and how do you source rare earth metals in effective ways and so on and so forth. But how does environmental challenges, in your view, change, if at all, the ways in which we might kind of imagine this sector growing?
Great, thank you. Just to summarize Tim's questions sort of on China, Valentino on, if you like, application to other sectors, Khalid on technology, and of course, environmental concerns. First, back to Tim's question. I also want to say maybe the center of gravity issue is actually not a gigantic. I wasn't out there to prove the shifts per se. So take it easy, all right? But Tim's question is extremely important because what role does China play in the global electronics industry? Now, actually, I will bring you to, funny enough, not the production side, consumption. Don't underestimate China as a market now. That's why in the book, I spend enormous effort to chart, if you like, the market imperative, that if you look at all of the segments, the biggest market now is in the Asia Pacific. It's not in the US, not in Europe. Number of TVs sold, number of smartphones sold, number of PCs sold. And of course, because of that, the consumption of chips. And also, as you know, the manufacturing capacity of chips. Basically, these currently are all Asia Pacific dominated, not even South Asia, but South Asia in terms of smartphone production and consumption. Yeah, semicon production very little in South Asia. So very much an East Asian story. So it is something you have to worry about. Not just the production side. Production side is very, I think the story is quite well known. So one has to be really careful now, because if you are the smartphone designer, producer, computer designer, producer, and hence all the embedded services from operating systems and so on, you have to ask yourself, who are you selling to, right? If China has almost maybe not, 1.3 billion people, but if you're talking about consumers, maybe a few hundred million. If few hundred million units cannot be sold because they forbid you from selling, that's few hundred million units, It's a lot, right? On the other hand, if you just sell to the China market, if you're a domestic brand, that's few hundred million too. That's pretty good business. It's self-sustaining in that sense. It's kind of good old days when, American firms, if you sell well in America, you don't need the rest of the world. The rest of the world was called international division. the multinational. If you remember that, the China story, isn't it? Yeah, U.S. multi-divisional firm. Outside the U.S. is called international. Everything is domestic. So that's the first point. So China, while being a big market, I'm actually less convinced that China will catch up in semicon, actually. Doug is very familiar with China's policy. I had a long debate with my good friend Wai-chung from Chinese Academy of Sciences, because he believed that as long as the Chinese government subsidized, put in $100 billion, China semicon will catch up. Can't catch up below the 10 nanometer because you don't have the photocopying machine, which is ASML. It's a photocopying machine. It's basically a lithography machine. And by the way, the single most important component in that machine, our dear German friends here, many of you, is the Zeiss lens. The lens is this big. That Zeiss lens, Germans can only polish so many units because very skilled German men and women needed to do the crafting. Each lens. That's why ASML this year can only make 55 units. Each one, 200 million euro. Yeah? You have 200 million euro, you walk into ASML, I want the machine today. Oh, sorry, don't have. It's all already taken up by TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, and Micron. Micron now begin to buy this. So it basically, very difficult. Semicon catch up, very, very difficult, I can tell you that. The assembly of smartphones, TVs, and PCs can be done. But the assembling firms, the original design manufacturers are all Taiwanese. Yeah, almost all Taiwanese. So again, it's a very peculiar story. Yeah. So I just want to say, interestingly, China has caught up in PC, for example. Lenovo is now the biggest in the world. I mean, when I interviewed, again, senior vice president of Dell, he said, I mean, yeah, we can bring Dell laptop back to Texas, but the problem is all components imported into the US will still suffer from the same tariffs. So how the hell can I sell the notebook after I assemble it in Texas, right? Cannot be done. iPhone is the same problem. You can assemble it in the US, but all components pay tariffs. And after that, nobody will, I mean, you guys in America will have to suffer because we buy the iPhone chip from China. You have to pay at least 30% more if you buy the iPhone in the US or the Dell laptop. Not possible, not feasible economically. So that's the China question. So what I'm trying to say is that I worry less about China's catching up, at least in this industry, in the most advanced technology, but of course in products, China can catch up, as you can already tell in PC, as you already can tell in smartphone, and TVs, and display panels, and so on and so forth. Jump straight to Dan Valentino's question. Now, bear in mind, the original objective of writing this book is kind of to prove that GPN 2.0 theory is perhaps doable. So actually my empirical chapters are structured exactly in terms of the where question, geographical configuration, the how means strategy, and the why question, right, the causal dynamics, as we theorize it in the GPN 2.0 theory. So the book, technically speaking, is an empirical application of a theory which we have developed in 2015. So in practice, now that I've done the empirical myself, is to say that it's entirely possible to apply it to other industries, automotive, garment, agro-food, and so on, because the various causal factors, and hence going back to Eric's question about where does technology rest here, right? And hence also respond to Khalid's question about technology, is to say, I have thought about this. Because actually the series I published is Innovation and Technology in the World Economy. So Martin keep pressing me, Kenny, this. Technology, where does technology go in your book? Very difficult. If I separate it out as an independent, separate variable, the problem is how do you then tell technology infused into causal dynamic? How does it work? So that's why I still currently fold it under cost capability ratio. So cost capability ratio is extremely important in determining the firm's strategy and response to competitive market pressure. It's not just lower cost. It has to be lower cost, high capability, meaning lowering costs at the same time improving your capability through, say, technological innovation. If you just use technology as a separate causal variable, I just feel that it's very difficult to theorize it in terms of the kind of either GVC or GPN dynamics. So that's kind of my easy response. And back to also Khalid's question on technology. Environmental, very, very important. I'm able to do it in this book. my postdoc in this project actually does work on this, on the, if you like. So during some of the interviews we went together, we also asked the supply chain officers, SVPs about the environmental side of their sourcing of the raw material and or recycling of the production side of this. So environmental concerns and sustainability issues are definitely going to be important. But what I wanted to do in this book is kind of to chart. I've written an exchange paper, published open access in environment planning A, called The Trouble with Global Production Networks. If you Google it, you can download EPA 2021, I think. The journal, I'm editor, so it's cheating. Yeah? Out of which I make the case that somebody has to do the comprehensive study of the industry, because then you're able to tell, if you like, the difference GPN makes, right? The GPN problem or trouble, right? Otherwise, you don't even need to talk about GPN, because whatever issues, environmental problem, it is just on its own. But if you think it's GPN related, then you've got to show how the industrial dynamics within those GPNs relate to the environmental issues, and vice versa, how our environmental pressures shape the ways in which value chain production networks are organized. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this book hopefully set that up and as a reference essentially of the industry in the 2010s, because we're in the 20s. So if you want to understand the 20s, you should understand a bit about the 10s as, if you like, and if possible, I mean, Doug's work in the 1990s on Taiwan is foundational to my earlier book, and of course, this book built on that one. So, because I mean, his work on Taiwan's semiconductor industry has been very important in industry and technology studies. So the point I think I want to make is that this book has limited ambition of 2010s, try to set the comprehensive, competitive study to show you that even two firms in the same industry, number one and number two, can do things very differently. Samsung and Apple in smartphone, for example, Lenovo and Dell in PCs, and Samsung and Intel in semiconductors, as well as, of course, the chipless firms such as, say, Qualcomm. Yeah? These are all competitors, direct competitors in exact industry segment, but they do things very differently. So that's really the objective of this book. Thank you.
We've got one more. You're not going to go away. We've got a couple more questions. So, Stefano.
Thank you, Henry. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It's a tag-on question of something that you discussed at the very end. I'm curious about, so you wrote it GPN 2.0 with Yeung. Now you really took that and empirically went all the way in and used the same structure and everything. So you made the point that, you basically made a call, now you go out and try it other places. It can be done, right? But within all the various components that you have, could you give us an insight on what you think worked better and what created you or gave you some trouble, so that other people may actually be aware of, ooh, okay, maybe I should do it in a slightly different way. And or, if you were to redo it again, now that you know the results, what would you do differently? Number three, do we need to wait for GPN 3.0, or can we do it 2.0 plus whatever reflectors there are?
Fair questions.
Okay, and we have a question at the back, Evgeny, and I think that might well be the last one, unless anybody's got a burning question they want to raise. Evgeny.
Thank you very much to all. It's been a pleasure to hear the reviews, and again, this introduction of the chapters in the book. I understand the book stopped in 2021 with the analysis, and I'm really wondering, given the trade war which you discussed, given the post-COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, and other things that might emerge in the next few years. If you have to write the book in 2031, would you call it interconnected worlds or the opposite? Because it seems that the dynamics goes into the other direction, and this is a global industry. Electronics industry is a global industry. It seems that competition matters, and it has different effects. So if you have to write a book in 10 years, what would be the title?
maybe I answer the last question first. If I were to write it, say, by the end of this decade, and hence get published in 2031, is that I hope I can still use the same title, because otherwise we will be in trouble, seriously. Remember, this book is about the electronics industry being interconnected, yeah, not the world in every sense of the word, yeah? So we know we have geopolitical troubles right now. I do hope, and the cases in war are not big players in electronics, so that helps, meaning the connections will still be there, right? Because Russia and Ukraine are not big players in electronics. But if China get dragged into this issue, and then as I mentioned to Tim's response to Tim, is that if China and US really went full-blown, then that one is a different story, and hence the book title will be abandoned by 2031, but that's not good for all of us, seriously. Okay, I cannot imagine the world split into two that way. I mean, it will be terrible. So I hope the title stands. So I hope that's the sort of quick answer to that. Back to Stefano's, I think maybe triple points or 2 points. One is this. There is no need to wait for GPN 3.0. In this book, of the 4 causal dynamics, the most difficult one to show empirically among, cost capability ratio, not difficult. Market imperative, not difficult because we have market data. Financial discipline and then risk. Financial discipline is the hardest. Despite at SASE, there are many papers on financialization. You can always talk about financialization, but very difficult to prove it. Look at Krippner's work. Krippner's extremely influential work because she spent enormous effort to look for every American firm, the non-financial institutions part of it, and chart that business and show how that influenced their strategy and practices. And that's why the book and her work become so influential, right? Krippner. So here, I had enormous difficulties of showing financial discipline. For example, in PCs, in smartphones. Even though, for example, Dell, I had a full Dell case there showing you Dell's financial management is such because of the number of days that they need to get the money back. So it's very important in the way they plan their outsourcing practices. Yeah, because you can't wait too long. I think 14 days, as the guy said. In semicon, the financial discipline mainly works through investment because it's huge capital outlay. You're talking about billions. Yeah. So even though, I mean, Doug mentioned government subsidized in South Korea, Taiwan, subsidized, but the subsidy will never today match even near to what Samsung can do, or SK Hynix in South Korea, or TSMC. TSMC this year is investing $44 billion into new fabs. The Taiwan government cannot come up with even $4 billion to subsidize. You know what I mean? But bearing in mind, when Doug was writing about TSMC in the early 1990s, when TSMC was in the late 80s spun off, was 40% owned by the government, 20% by Philips. Yeah, it was Philips, 20%, remember? Yeah, that's how TSMC was founded. Yeah, because based on Philips technology transfer. That's why Philips had 20% ownership, eventually divested. Taiwan government 40%. Today still own about maybe 20%, I think, if you look at TSMC's shareholders. About 20% owned by the state. So this is no small business. So going back again to Stefano's, the other point is that so basically financial discipline, the hardest. Risk, again, is impossible to prove mathematically. Risk, we can only discuss it, if you like, discursively, case study based, so to speak, based on also interviews whereby the firm senior executives tell us that, we decided to set up new fabs, say in Southeast Asia, in order to minimize the risk of having all eggs in one basket. So say in Taiwan. Yeah? That's why Singapore benefit from, if you like, the geopolitical tension, the China-Taiwan relations, for example, because you don't want to put all your chips in one place, right? But the problem is it's not actually as so simple because the actual technology is different. So just because you have fabs in Singapore doesn't mean automatically it can supply to the same qualified chip. Say automotive industry, very difficult because every chip, every process, once is qualified by the, say, German manufacturer or Japanese manufacturer, the car makers, 20 years. They have to make the same chip for 20 years. So it's not so simple. All of these are in the book, but these are very complex stories to explain why, the chip shortages you know of today has many underlying reasons. It's not easy to understand. But once you have unpacked it, then you realize, no wonder you have a chip problem now. Because, you know, say BMW told its tier 1 suppliers, hey, we're not going to sell that many cars in 2020, okay? People were not driving. So don't order too many chips. And once they stop ordering from the chip makers lost their quotas to smartphone makers. And once they lost to the smartphone makers, you can't gain it back immediately, all right? Because who are you? You know, Apple is paying more. Huh? So no way. That's why you have, you want to buy a car, sorry, because the chip not ready, so you can't get it. So, I mean, these are all really complicated stories. But I will say, I find financial discipline the hardest to execute in our theory. A lot more work needed, from my point of view. The role of the state is the same. Role of the state is always difficult to pin down in causal terms. You know what I mean? So these are, to me, the biggest paradoxes or the biggest nuts to be cracked in the kind of research I do, yeah. Thank you.